Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and this is our Microeconomics review. So, we're going to talk briefly through how to do all the graphing for microeconomics that you're going to need to know. So we're going to talk a little bit about the law of supply, the law of demand, and then we're going to bring in some of the more complicated types of graphs, price floors, price ceilings, taxes, and then eventually your average total cost graph. So I'm going to go through these, and hopefully this will make sense to us. The law of demand is pretty straightforward. It's the relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. It's what gives us a downward sloping demand curve. And what this means is that at a very high price, the quantity demanded is going to be relatively low, whereas at a low price, the quantity demanded is going to be relatively high. This is completely intuitive, of course, as when things are very expensive, fewer people can buy them, whereas when goods are cheaper, more people can purchase them. So that is our law of demand. It's what gives us our downward sloping demand curve. The law of supply is an inverse relation here. So for our supply curve, economists show a upward sloping supply curve because at a high price, producers can make more profit and the quantity supplied is relatively high. Whereas at a low price, there is not a lot of profit and the quantity supplied is relatively low. So high price, quantity supplied is high. Low price, quantity supplied is low. This gives us an upward sloping supply curve. Supply and demand intersect where the supply and demand curves cross. This is what we call the equilibrium point, and it gives us what's called equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Equilibrium price is the price that is determined by the market by the conjunction of the supply and demand curves for all the buyers and sellers. Equilibrium quantity is the total number of products that are produced and then sold when the market is at perfect equilibrium. Obviously, this is not always the case. If a price for an item is too high, then the quantity supplied would be greater than the quantity demanded, which is going to create a surplus. Whereas if the price is too low, quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, creating a shortage. Generally, if a surplus list exists for too long, eventually the price will fall back to equilibrium. Whereas if a shortage exists for too long, the price will rise, again bringing us back to equilibrium. This is how the market self-readjusts itself and eventually gets back to that equilibrium point. We also have consumer and producer surplus when the market exists at equilibrium. Consumer surplus is the extra happiness that consumers get when market prices are at equilibrium. This is because there are all of these buyers out here who would have paid significantly more. For example, quantity Q buyers would have paid price P, which is much higher than the equilibrium price. Because of that, all of those additional buyers get to pay significantly less, leading to additional happiness. So consumer surplus is this area below the demand curve above equilibrium price, showing the additional happiness that consumers get. Producer surplus is the area above the supply curve because at this price, quantity Q prime sellers would still produce that good, but they get to charge a much higher price, so this is all of the additional profit that they would generate over the amount that they would have been willing to produce the product for. So that gives us our consumer and producer surplus. These are all the components of supply. Input prices are the prices for the things that go into making a product, so the various components. Technology is the capital used to construct a product. Number of sellers is, of course, the number of people producing the product. And producer expectations are the expectations of future profits for producers making a product. So if input prices go up, supply goes down. If technology increases, supply increases. And of course, if it decreases or assets are destroyed, supply would go down. Increasing number of sellers leads to an increase in supply, whereas a decreasing number of sellers leads to a decrease in supply. And increasing producer expectations increases supply, whereas decreasing producer expectations decreases supply. The determinants of demand are income. When income goes up, demand goes up. When income goes down, demand goes down. Prices of related goods. Complementary goods are goods that improve your enjoyment of a product. So an increase in complement price decreases demand, whereas a decrease in complement price increases demand. Substitutes are substitute products for a good. An increase in the price of a substitute would increase demand because you'd be more likely to buy that product. And a decrease in the price of a substitute would decrease demand because you would buy the substitute instead. Number of buyers, more buyers equals more demand, fewer buyers equals less demand. And consumer expectations, increase in consumer expectations is going to increase demand, whereas decrease in consumer expectations might decrease demand. So those are our various components of both. Now we're going to shift supply and demand curves and talk about what this looks like. So we'll draw our standard supply and demand curve on here. Equilibrium, there's our price, there's our quantity. Now say we're talking about the price of hot dogs, or the market for hot dogs. If the price of hamburgers decreases, this is going to lead to a decrease in demand for hot dogs. So we show that with a leftward shift of our demand curve, giving us a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. So we say market for hot dogs again. Say now you see a decrease in the price of hot dog buns, which are a complementary good to hot dogs. In this case, you would show an increase in demand. Leading to an increase in price and an increase in quantity. Now, for example, for our market for hot dogs, the price of beef increases. Price of beef is of course, get our equilibrium in there, equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, label our demand curve. Beef is of course one of the inputs to hot dogs, so an increase in the price of beef would lead to a decrease in the supply of hot dogs. Supply prime, price prime, quantity prime, equilibrium prime. Showing a decrease in supply, which would increase price and would decrease the quantity that it both supplied and demanded. And let's do one more. So our market for hot dogs again. Now, in this case, we'll show an increase in the number of hot dog sellers. A number of people open up hot dog carts. This would increase the supply of hot dogs. Now we've got a new equilibrium. Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, dropping the price of hot dogs and increasing the quantity both supplied and demanded. Those are the various ways that supply and demand intersect in order to change our curves, so make sure you can do all of those things. We also have things called price floors. Price floors establish a minimum price. At this minimum price, quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied, so it creates a surplus. We see an increasing of producer surplus, a decreasing of consumer surplus, and all of this deadweight loss, which is lost happiness, because the price is higher than equilibrium. This is exactly the opposite than what we would see with the price floor. A price floor, of course, a price floor would prevent the price from falling. A price ceiling down here, so this is a ceiling, would prevent the price from rising. With a price ceiling, quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded, which would create a shortage, would lead to all of this being consumer surplus, and this is still our deadweight loss, our lost happiness because of that price ceiling. So price floor at the top, preventing prices from falling. price ceiling at the bottom, preventing prices from rising, both of them leading to deadweight loss and either increasing producer surplus or consumer surplus, depending on if it's a price floor or price ceiling. Taxes are generally, especially consumption taxes, are generally shown as a change in supply. Producers will factor this in as if they were an input cost, so you show simply a leftward shift in supply when you add a tax. So a tax is shown by decreasing supply. But because it doesn't actually change the equation for producers, what it leads to is, here's your equilibrium quantity, as if equilibrium was right here, but tax revenue is the place where this line crosses the supply curve, where the quantity crosses the supply curve at the new equilibrium. Tax revenue is this amount here, the difference between the price that the producer would sell it for and the actual price after the tax times the quantity, and then deadweight loss is still that component right there. So this is how you graph a consumption tax. You show it as a decrease in supply, and the tax revenue is, again, the difference between the price with the tax and the price that the producer would produce it for at that quantity. And then there's your deadweight loss. Okay, now we're going to talk about your average total cost curve. So as you can see, I've already drawn a standard supply and demand curve, figured out equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, all that fun stuff. Now we'll draw in our those should probably be, I'm going to draw those again. Okay, so I've drawn in my average total cost curve, my average variable cost curve, and my marginal cost curve. As we remember, marginal cost is the cost of the last unit, and average total cost is the average cost of producing all the units across the production run. We then get our marginal revenue by taking the price that the market gives us and extending it across. And as always, we produce until marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That then gives us our quantity. And by comparing marginal revenue with average total cost, we figure out the amount of profit that an individual firm would get from producing a product. So profit is shown by this area bounded by the difference between marginal revenue and average total cost. Now let's show a change in either supply or demand. So if we say that demand for this product changes, this gives us a new equilibrium price and a new equilibrium quantity. Then we get a new marginal revenue, and we get more profit in this situation. So in this situation with an increase in demand, the firm's profit is now this box here, and their quantity is right there. We can also see what happens when marginal revenue falls, so we'll redraw all of this. So here's our original marginal revenue curve. Now in this situation, say we see an increase in supply. Gives us a new equilibrium price, new equilibrium quantity, new marginal revenue. Now, we still produce as long as marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, as we see right here. This gives us a new equilibrium quantity, but now, because our price, our marginal revenue is below our average total cost curve, this area here shows the amount of money that the individual firm is losing. And so when we see a situation in which price falls, profit will generally decrease, whereas when price rises, prices for the individual firm in the short run will generally increase until we incorporate in and shift those cost curves. So that is all the graphing that you need to know for the microeconomic test. And so I'll leave it at that, and if you have any questions, hopefully we'll be able to address them through email or coming in and talking to me.